There is a cartoon that began as a silly adventure show about a boy and his magical dog, and somewhere along the way, without making a big announcement about it, became one of the most emotionally careful pieces of animated television ever made for a young audience. Adventure Time ran for 10 seasons on Cartoon Network, from 2010 to 2018, and in that time it gave children something they rarely get from a show aimed at them: real grief, real longing, real joy that costs something. It built a world called Ooh on the bones of a war nobody ever fully explained. It hid thousand-year-old tragedies inside jokes. It let a villain who wanted to end all life walk through an episode without a single punchline. Tonight, we are moving slowly through the most iconic episodes this show ever made, the stories inside them, the feelings they left behind, and the quiet way they changed things. Welcome to Jakku. Let's get started. The world of Ooh. What Adventure Time really is. There is something unusual about the way Adventure Time begins. The show does not spend its early moments explaining where it is set or how the world came to be the way it is. It simply drops a viewer into color and motion, into a land of candy kingdoms and ice wizards and talking dogs. And it trusts that the strangeness itself will be enough to keep someone watching. For a children's cartoon, that is a surprisingly confident move. Most shows of that kind spend a lot of energy making sure the audience is oriented, making sure nothing feels too confusing or too unexplained. Adventure Time does the opposite. It invites the viewer to simply be in the world, to absorb it without needing it all laid out in clear, careful terms. The show was created by Pendleton Ward and first aired on Cartoon Network on April 5, 2010. It followed Finn, a human boy voiced by Jeremy Shada, and his best friend and adoptive brother Jake, a dog with magical powers voiced by John DiMaggio. Jake could stretch and shrink and reshape himself into almost anything, which made him useful in the many adventures the two of them stumbled into across the land of Ooh. The early episodes were light and funny and strange in a way that felt effortless. Finn and Jake would go on quests, fight low-stakes villains, help princesses, and return home to their tree fort having learned something small or nothing at all. That was enough. The show was warm and energetic and full of the kind of comfortable absurdity that makes a cartoon easy to spend time with. But the land of Ooh, if a person looked at it carefully, was not simply a fantasy world. The candy people, the ruins in the backgrounds of outdoor scenes, the occasional glimpse of something that looked like an old highway or a collapsed building, these were not accidents. They were clues. The show had been built on top of something older and darker than it was initially letting on. The land of Ooh, as fans slowly began to piece together across the first few seasons, was Earth. A version of Earth that had survived something catastrophic, something referred to only in whispers and passing references as the Mushroom War. A nuclear or mutagenic event of some kind, distant enough in time that the civilization which came after it had no direct memory of what had been lost, but recent enough that the bones of that civilization were still visible if someone knew where to look. That slow reveal was part of what made Adventure Time different. The world had weight underneath its brightness. The jokes landed against a backdrop of something that had actually ended, and the characters living in Ooh were not just inhabitants of a fantasy kingdom, but inheritors of a catastrophe they could not fully understand. The show never made this heavy-handed. It did not stop to explain the Mushroom War in detail or give a lecture about what had been destroyed. It simply let the ruins sit there in the background, let the occasional reference pass by without comment, and trusted that the audience, including the young audience it was officially made for, would feel the gravity of it, even if they could not name what they were feeling. Finn was the only known human in the land of Ooh for much of the show's run, which is its own strange detail. In a world full of candy people, shape-shifting dogs, vampire queens, and talking rainicorns, the human boy was the odd one out. His humanness was unusual rather than central. He was not the representative of what the world used to be. He was a remnant of something, raised by a family of magical dogs, growing up with no real context for what he was or where his kind had gone. That question, what happened to the humans? Where did they all go? Was one the show returned to periodically, without ever rushing toward a full answer. Princess Bubblegum, voiced by Hynden Walch, ruled the Candy Kingdom and was one of the show's most important recurring figures from the very beginning. She was intelligent and warm, and often morally complicated in ways that took years to fully reveal themselves. Marceline the Vampire Queen, voiced by Olivia Olson, appeared early in the show as an antagonist and slowly became one of its most beloved characters. A thousand-year-old vampire with a history too long and too painful to explain all at once. Ice King, voiced by Tom Kenny, was the show's original recurring villain, a bumbling old wizard who kidnapped princesses and was perpetually defeated by Finn and Jake, and who turned out, eventually, to be carrying a tragedy so enormous that every silly scene that came before it had to be quietly reread. The voice cast gave the show a particular emotional texture. Tom Kenny, already famous for his work on other animated series, brought something gentle and strange to Ice King, a quality that made the character feel like someone who had once been something else entirely, long before before the show ever confirmed that that was true. John DiMaggio's Jake was warm and unhurried, a character who loved his life and was not troubled by questions that had no good answers. Jeremy Shawta's Finn was earnest and energetic, a boy who wanted very badly to be good, in a world that did not always make it easy to know what good meant. The show ran on Cartoon Network from 2010 to 2018, producing 10 seasons and 283 episodes. After its conclusion, it continued in the form of Distant Lands, a series of 4 feature-length specials on HBO Max, and later in the spin-off series Adventure Time, Fiona and Cake, which explored the gender-swapped alternate universe versions of the main characters. The original series, though, is the thing. The 10 seasons that built this world piece by piece, that hid grief inside jokes and let joy cost something, that trusted a young audience to sit with feelings they might not be able to name. There are certain episodes from that run that people return to, certain ones that do something the others do not, that take the lightness and warmth of the show and push it somewhere quieter and deeper, somewhere that stays with a person long after the episode has ended. Those are the ones this video is about. Not every episode, not a full history of every season, just the ones that went further, the ones that asked more, the ones that lingered. The Land of Ooo was always hiding something. The best episodes are the ones where it stopped hiding it just for a little while and let the viewer see what was underneath. Adventure Time arrived at a specific moment in animated television when the question of what a children's show was allowed to do was being quietly renegotiated. Shows that had come before it had occasionally dipped into real emotion, occasionally let a serious moment pass through without deflecting it with a joke. But Adventure Time did it with unusual consistency and unusual care. It was not a show that stumbled into depth. It was a show that was built with depth waiting inside it, layered underneath the silliness, like something buried, ready to surface when the time was right. That patience is part of what made it work. The show took its time. It let characters be funny and light and ridiculous for long enough that when the serious moments arrived, they arrived against a full background. They were not isolated gestures toward emotional weight. They were the product of everything that had come before, of all the time spent in the world of Ooo, learning to love the people in it. That is what makes these episodes worth watching slowly and carefully. Not because they are dark, not because they are sad in a simple way, but because they earned everything they asked the viewer to feel. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 1 introduced us to the world of Ooo and the quiet depth that Adventure Time built beneath its bright and playful surface. Now we move to the moment when the show revealed it had a true villain, one with no jokes and no softness, and everything changed. Section 2, The Lich, when a kids' show stopped playing around. For the first season and a half of Adventure Time, the threats that Finn and Jake faced were manageable in a particular way. Ice King was bumbling and persistent, but never genuinely frightening. Marceline was mysterious and intimidating, but also funny, also capable of warmth. The dungeon crawls and the monster fights and the low-stakes rescues of various princesses all had a quality of play about them, a quality that matched the show's energy. Things happened, but they did not leave marks. The characters came through. The world stayed bright. Then came The Lich. The Lich first appeared in the Season 2 episode Mortal Folly, which aired on May 2, 2011. He was voiced by Ron Perlman, an actor whose voice carries a particular kind of unhurried authority, and from the first moment he spoke, something was different. The Lich was not a villain with a quirk or a catchphrase or a comedic angle. He was an ancient entity whose sole purpose was the destruction of all life. Not conquest, not power, not revenge, extinction. He wanted living things to stop existing, and he wanted this not out of anger or trauma, but simply because it was what he was. The destruction of life was his nature, the way flight is the nature of a bird. The writers and storyboarders at Adventure Time made a deliberate choice with the Lich. They described their original intention for the character as an entity that was never, ever funny. In a show where almost everything had a comedic dimension, where even the scariest moments were usually followed by something absurd, the Lich was kept completely outside that register. He did not make jokes. He was not defeated in a humiliating or silly way that undercut his menace. He was treated with a straightness that the show had not applied to any other antagonist, and that straightness changed how a viewer experienced him. Before the Lich arrived in Mortal Folly, Finn and Jake had been protecting the land of Ooo with something close to ease. They were good at fighting, quick thinking, and brave, and the world had rewarded that competence consistently. The Lich introduced the experience of being genuinely outmatched. Finn faced him and was afraid in a way the show had not shown before. Afraid not just of losing a fight, but of something much larger, of a force so indifferent to his existence that the usual tools of heroism simply did not apply. The episode begins with a warning from a cosmic entity called the Ancient Psychic Tandem War Elephant, which sounds like a joke, and in many ways is, but the warning is not. Something old and dangerous had awakened, the elephant communicated to Finn in a dream, and it was moving through the world. When Finn and Jake eventually encounter the Lich, he is inside a well on the outskirts of the Candy Kingdom, surrounded by a field of dead grass that spreads from his presence like a wound in the ground. The animation in these scenes is noticeably different from the show's usual brightness. The palette is darker, the movement slower and more deliberate. The show was using its visual language to signal that this was not the usual register. What the Lich represented within the world of Adventure Time went deeper than being a powerful enemy. He was, as would eventually be confirmed across later seasons, a product of the Mushroom War, a being created or summoned by the same catastrophic event that had destroyed the old world and given rise to Ooo. He was not just a threat to the present, he was a remnant of the past, a consequence of what human beings had done to themselves long before Finn was born. That connection between the Lich and the Mushroom War gave his existence a resonance that a straightforward fantasy villain would not have had. He was not evil from nowhere. He was evil from somewhere very specific, from the worst thing that had ever happened to the world, and that made him feel more real and more terrible. Ron Perlman's voice performance contributed enormously to this effect. There is a scene in Mortal Folly where the Lich speaks to Princess Bubblegum, who has been captured, and what he says is simple. There is a darkness in him, he tells her, that has no bottom and no edge, and she should not mistake his patience for anything other than inevitability. The words are not especially complex. The delivery is everything. Perlman speaks them with a quiet certainty that does not need emphasis, does not need volume. It is the voice of something that has waited a very long time and is not troubled by waiting more. The season finale, Mortal Folly, ends with Princess Bubblegum being thrown into the Lich's well by the Ice King during a confused attempt to help, which is both funny and terrible in the way the best Adventure Time moments are. The Lich has been momentarily driven back by a sweater, of all things, a sweater that Princess Bubblegum had knitted for Finn and that carried some quality of warmth or love that the Lich found intolerable. This detail is very much in keeping with the show's sensibility. The most powerful weapon against a force of pure destruction turns out to be something domestic and loving, something a grandmother might have made. But the Lich is not defeated. He is merely stopped, and Princess Bubblegum is in serious danger. The two-part arc continued into Mortal Recoil, where Bubblegum is briefly possessed by the Lich before being saved, and where the show drew a careful line between the warmth of the Candy Kingdom and the cold indifference the Lich carried everywhere he went. The final image of the arc, with the Lich's green fire eye visible in the darkness after his apparent defeat, was the show's way of making clear that this was not over. The Lich did not end. He waited. He returned in a major way in the Season 4 finale, also titled The Lich, where he disguised himself as the beloved hero Billy in order to trick Finn and Jake into helping him open a portal to the multiverse. This betrayal, using the form of a character Finn genuinely admired and trusted, was particularly cruel, and the show played it with full seriousness. Finn discovered mid-episode that Billy had been dead all along, that the Lich had been wearing him, and the visual of the Lich inside Billy's familiar shape, dropping that shape as the deception became unnecessary, was one of the more genuinely disturbing images the show ever produced. What the Lich did to Adventure Time was clarify something about what the show was willing to be. A children's cartoon that contains a villain who wants to end all life, who never makes a joke, who is played with complete straightness and genuine menace, is making a particular kind of argument about its audience. It is arguing that children can hold that weight, that they do not need every threat diffused, every monster made silly, every dark moment softened into something manageable, that sometimes a thing is simply frightening, and a young viewer can sit with that and come through it and still find the warmth of the show waiting on the other side. The Lich was that argument made physical. He was the show's proof that it took both its world and its audience seriously. He appeared again and again across the run of the series, always finding new shapes, always returning from whatever defeat had been inflicted on him. He was turned into a harmless giant baby after being splashed with the blood of an ethereal guardian in the Season 6 episodes Wake Up and Escape from the Citadel. And that baby, renamed Sweet Pea, grew up in the Candy Kingdom under the care of Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig, attended school, had nightmares. The Lich was still there inside him, dormant but present, surfacing occasionally in those nightmares before the warmth of the life Sweet Pea was living pushed it back down. That image of an ancient force of destruction being slowly, tentatively healed by the experience of being loved and cared for was quintessential Adventure Time, something enormous and dark, held gently by something small and ordinary, and not defeated but changed, at least for now. The Lich is not the most emotionally complex figure in Adventure Time. That distinction belongs to other characters whose grief and longing are more personal and more human, but he is the most important. He is the reason the show's brightness had weight. He was what everything was measured against. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Lich showed us what was truly at stake in the land of Ooo, a threat so complete and so cold that no amount of warmth could could make it funny. In the next section, we follow Finn and Jake through a dimensional portal into a world built from a single wish, a world where the Lich never existed, and discover what that costs. Section 3. Finn the Human and Jake the Dog, the multiverse premiere. There is a version of Finn the Human who never went on a single adventure. He woke up on a farm every morning, helped his parents with the animals, lived in a world that was quiet and rural and small. He had a dog named Jake, but Jake was just a dog, not a magical shapeshifter, not a companion in the truest sense of the word. He had a mule named Bartram. He had a baby brother. He had parents who were alive and present. He had, in almost every measurable way, more than the Finn the show had spent 4 seasons following. And yet, something about that version of him, when placed on screen, felt immediately and unmistakably diminished. The farm world Finn, as fans came to call him, was living the safer life, and it was heartbreaking to watch. That is the central emotional surprise of the Season 5 2-part premiere, which aired on Cartoon Network on November 12, 2012. The episodes were titled Finn the Human and Jake the Dog, named after the characters themselves rather than after any adventure or enemy or location, which was a deliberate and meaningful choice. The show was stripping things back to basics. After the cosmic chaos of the Season 4 finale, in which the Lich had disguised himself as the beloved hero Billy and tricked Finn and Jake into opening a multiversal portal, the show arrived at its 5th season with a question that was much more personal than it initially appeared. If the bad things had never happened, if the war had not destroyed civilization and given rise to Ooh, if the Lich had never existed and Finn had simply grown up on a farm with a family who loved him, would that be better? Would that be the world you would choose? The episodes were written and storyboarded by separate creative teams. Jesse Moynihan and Tom Herpich handled Finn the Human, while Rebecca Sugar and Cole Sanchez wrote and boarded Jake the Dog. The stories for both were developed together by Patrick McHale, Kent Osborne, and Pendleton Ward. Because 4 separate storyboardists were involved, they coordinated closely so that the 2 episodes would feel unified, and what resulted was a premiere that critics praised precisely because of how clearly it captured 2 different but complementary aspects of the show's identity. Finn the Human was heavy with mythology and action. Jake the Dog was warmer, funnier, more about sitting still and being with someone you trust. Together, they made something that felt complete. The premise arrived directly from the Season 4 finale. The Lich had entered Prismo's time room, a place described as existing outside of time itself, somewhere at the center of the multiverse. Prismo, voiced by Kumail Nanjiani in a performance that was quietly one of the most charming things the show ever produced, was a wish granter. A flat, pink shadow figure who projected onto the floor of his time room, Prismo offered each visitor exactly 1 wish, but with a warning attached. His wishes had a way of going wrong, not out of malice, out of the nature of wishing itself. Every wish, Prismo explained, tended towards some ironic consequence, some sideways interpretation of what the wisher had wanted. The trick, he would eventually explain to Jake, was to be very specific. The Lich made his wish without hesitation. He wished for the extinction of all life. Then Finn, watching in horror and refusing to simply be carried along by events, made his own wish in response. He wished that the Lich had never even existed. What the show then presented was the reality that wish created. Finn appeared in a version of Earth that felt familiar in structure, a landscape of fields and farmsteads and small towns, but familiar in the specific way that something broken looks familiar when it has been repaired badly. The Mushroom War had never happened because Simon Petrikov, before losing himself entirely to the power of the magical Ice Crown, had used that power to freeze the mutagenic bomb, sacrificing himself in the process. The bomb never detonated. The Lich was never created, but the world was still not saved. The Crown's magic had caused a different kind of catastrophe, an ice age that had set civilization back by centuries. Humanity survived, but Ooh did not exist. The Candy People did not exist. Princess Bubblegum did not exist. The magic land that Finn had spent his entire life in, the world that had shaped everything he was and everyone he loved, was simply absent. Finn found himself in this world as a version of himself who had grown up in it. He had a family, he had a farm, he had a mule. His Jake was a regular dog who could not speak or stretch or give advice or wrap himself around a falling friend. The Destiny Gang, a group of local thugs, terrorized the residents of Junktown, which was the name of the nearest settlement and farm world. Finn tried to stand up to them the way adventurers do, with bravery and forward motion, but without the training and the confidence and the years of experience that Ooh had built in the Finn the show knew. When he found the magical Ice Crown, hidden among the things that had been left behind from Simon's sacrifice, the episode made its darkest turn. The crown, as the show had already established through Ice King's history, did not simply grant power. It consumed the person wearing it. It gave and took away simultaneously, offering control over ice and cold while dismantling the personality of whoever held it. Simon Petrikov had worn the crown again and again over centuries because he had to, because there was someone to protect and no other way to do it, and the price was himself. Now Farm World Finn, desperate and afraid, put it on his head. What followed was visually and emotionally disturbing in a way that children's animation rarely allows itself to be. Farm World Finn began to lose himself. He became Ice Finn, erratic and dangerous, his body taking on the proportions of the Ice King, his behavior becoming uncontrolled and violent. He managed to put out fires and save his family from the immediate threat of the Destiny Gang, but the Crown's corruption was too complete. He could not stop. His uncontrolled power caused the mushroom bomb to detonate after all, destroying the area around Junktown. And then the Lich was unleashed anyway, not from a bomb, but from the goo that had pooled in the aftermath of the explosion, taking over the body of Farm World Jake and turning him into a horrific, Lich-possessed creature that advanced on Farm World Finn in the smoldering ruin of what had been a farm. All of this was happening while the real Jake, the magical talking dog from Ooh, sat in Prismo's time room watching it on a television screen. That contrast is one of the most quietly brilliant structural decisions the two-part premiere makes. While Finn was experiencing genuine trauma in the alternate reality, Jake was eating pickles and sitting in a jacuzzi with Prismo and the Cosmic Owl, talking about relationships and beatboxing. He could see that things were going badly for Farm World Finn. He knew he had a wish available that could fix it, and he kept not using it, partly out of genuine confidence that Finn would work it out, and partly because he was Jake, and Jake's relationship with urgency had always been flexible. Prismo kept making him food instead of letting him waste his wish on sandwiches, and Jake kept finding reasons to chat a little longer. The comedy of that situation, two cosmic beings and a magical dog sitting in a hot tub while chaos unfolded on a television across the room, was pure adventure time. The show had always held lightness and darkness in the same frame, and here it was doing so with unusual structural clarity. Two different tones, two different episodes, two different experiences running simultaneously, and the result was something that felt more like real life than most children's television dares to be. Bad things can be happening to someone while someone else is having a perfectly lovely afternoon. Both of those things can be true. When Jake finally used his wish, it was because the Cosmic Owl accidentally unmuted the television screen while reaching for chips, and Jake heard Farm World Finn's voice and understood that things had crossed into territory that were not going to fix themselves. The wish he made, coached carefully by Prismo, was specific in the way that mattered. He wished that the Lich's original wish had been for Finn and Jake to return home, instead of the extinction of all life. That rewording threaded the needle. It changed what had happened without creating a new, alternate reality. Finn and Jake returned to Ooh. The Lich was sent back into a weakened state in the time room. The magical jewels that had opened the portal flew back to their respective owners across Ooh, including the Ice King, who was, in the show's final comedic image of the two-part episode, interrogating his penguin Gunter about where the jewel had gone. Finn returned home with no memory of anything that had occurred. Jake remembered everything. That asymmetry is significant. Finn had experienced something enormous, had worn a crown that consumed him, had watched a version of his dog be possessed by the most destructive force in existence, had lived in a world that was worse precisely because the thing that had hurt it most had been removed. He came home carrying none of that. Jake came home carrying all of it and said nothing, and watched his friend be happy, and felt, the episode implied, something close to relief so intense it was hard to separate from grief. The Season 5 premiere drew 3.435 million viewers when it aired. Critics from the AV Club and IndieWire both praised it for being simultaneously mythology-heavy and emotionally clear. For managing to expand the show's lore without losing sight of the two characters the show was always fundamentally about. The episodes also planted seeds that would grow across seasons. The existence of Farm World as a parallel reality that persisted beyond Jake's corrective wish. The character of Prismo, who would return and eventually meet a fate that devastated both Jake and the audience. And the image of Finn wearing a crown and losing himself in it, which would echo forward into later explorations of his character's fear of powerlessness. What the Farm World premiere asked, beneath all its multiverse mechanics and alternate timelines, was a question about the value of difficulty. Finn's life in Ooh was hard in ways that Farm World Finn's life never was. He had faced existential threats. He had grown up as the only human in a world that did not fully understand what he was. He had lost things and been afraid and made mistakes with real consequences. But those hard things were also the things that made him who he was. Remove the difficulty, remove the Lich and the Mushroom War and the chaos of Ooh, and what comes back is a version of Finn who is smaller, not just in the sense of having less power or fewer abilities, but in the sense of having less interior landscape, less of the self that gets built by going through things and coming out the other side. Jake ate his sandwich in Prismo's time room and felt happy about the pickles, and then paid attention when it mattered, and then brought his brother home. That is its own kind of wisdom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Farm World premiere showed us what ooh costs and what it gives back in return. Now we move to the episode that most people agree broke something open in this show quietly and completely. The one where a joke character sang a song to the person he used to be, and neither of them could hear each other. Section 4. I Remember You. The episode that broke everyone quietly. The Ice King, across the early seasons of Adventure Time, was played almost entirely for comedy. He was bumbling, persistent, and ridiculous. An old wizard in a blue robe who kidnapped princesses and was regularly defeated by Finn and Jake with relatively little effort. He complained. He was lonely. He had a pack of penguins he treated as pets and confidants, and his favorite of them was named Gunter, which he seemed to call all the penguins regardless of which one he meant. He was not menacing. He was not particularly dangerous. He was the kind of villain who made the show feel lighter by comparison, a recurring obstacle that generated episodes without generating dread. Most viewers, especially younger ones, probably laughed at him more than they thought about him. Then came Season 4, Episode 25. The episode aired on October 15, 2012, and it was titled, I Remember You. It was written and storyboarded by Cole Sanchez and Rebecca Sugar, and it was unlike anything the show had done before. Not because it was loud or dramatic or built around a big action set piece, because it was quiet and careful and entirely about grief. And it delivered that grief in a way that respected the audience enough to never explain what it was asking them to feel. The premise of the episode is simple. Marceline goes to visit the Ice King because she has found an old song among his belongings, something he seems to have written long ago, and she wants to make music with him. This is not unusual in the world of Adventure Time. Marceline was always musically inclined. The Ice King was always eager for company. The idea of them collaborating on a song sounds, on the surface, like something that could be funny and warm and entirely comfortable. What the episode is actually about is the specific grief of watching someone you love disappear into an illness that took their memory. The Ice King, as had been slowly seeded across the previous seasons through small details and passing references, was not always the Ice King. He was once a man named Simon Petrikov, an antiquarian and scholar who had purchased a magical crown that slowly consumed his identity over the course of years. The crown had given him power over ice and cold. In exchange, it had taken his memories, his personality, and eventually his name. By the time of the show's present, the Ice King had no recollection of having been Simon at all. He did not know who Marceline was in the truest sense, could not retrieve the context of who she had been to him, could not hold the history they had shared. He was not pretending. He had simply lost it. Marceline knew this. She remembered. And in the episode, she tries gently and repeatedly and unsuccessfully to remind him. The old song she brings to him was written by Simon, not by the Ice King. It is filled with references to their shared history, to the years after the Mushroom War, when Simon had protected a small girl named Marcy as she grew up in the ruins of a destroyed civilization. He had written it to her while he was still lucid enough to understand what was happening to him, while he could still see himself changing, and wanted her to know, wanted to put it somewhere safe in case he lost the ability to say it directly. The song was full of love and apology and recognition, an awareness that the person she had trusted was going away and could not stop it from happening. The Ice King does not know any of this. He reads the song and cannot place it. He performs it with her, cheerfully, treating it as a creative exercise, not understanding that every line he sings is something the man he used to be wrote specifically for the person now sitting across from him. He is enthusiastic and off-key and completely in the dark, and Marceline is in tears, and he cannot understand why, and he cheerfully asks if she is okay and suggests they keep going. That gap between what Marceline knows and what the Ice King is capable of knowing is where the episode lives. It never announces itself as a tragedy. It never stops to explain what is happening or why it is sad. It simply shows the two of them together in a room, one person holding an enormous amount of history and the other holding none of it, and lets the viewer feel the distance between them in real time. Rebecca Sugar, who wrote and storyboarded the episode alongside Cole Sanchez, had noted in discussing the show that the Ice King and Marceline episode was designed to work on multiple levels simultaneously. For a child watching it, it could be understood as something strange and a little melancholy, a story about an old man who is confused and a woman who is sad for reasons not entirely explained. For an older viewer, or for a child who had watched a grandparent or parent disappear into memory loss, the episode landed differently. It was precise about a specific kind of grief, the grief of still being present with someone whose ability to be present with you is gone. Tom Kenny, who voiced the Ice King throughout the series, brought something essential to the episode's emotional effect. His performance in I Remember You was not played for laughs. The cheerfulness was still there, the enthusiasm and the eagerness to connect, but stripped of comedy. The Ice King singing that old song with Marceline and not understanding what he was singing, his voice warm and present while his comprehension was entirely elsewhere, was quietly devastating in the way that only very good voice acting can achieve. Kenny was not playing tragic, he was playing genuine, which was worse. Olivia Olsen's Marceline was the episode's other anchor. Marceline rarely cried in the show. She was a 1,000 years old, sharp and self-sufficient, and her default register was cool and slightly guarded. Watching her cry quietly in that room, trying to hold herself together while singing a song that was both for her and not for her at all, was one of the most emotionally precise moments the show produced across its entire run. Not just because it was sad, because it was true to something recognizable about loss that was not often depicted in animation aimed at young people. The episode also recontextualized everything that had come before it. Every silly Ice King scene, every bumbling villain moment, every kidnapped princess, and every comedic defeat at Finn and Jake's hands had to be read differently after I Remember You. The Ice King's loneliness was not a character flaw or a comedic trait, it was a symptom. He was lonely because the person he had been, Simon, had known love and connection and warmth, and some echo of that remained in the Ice King even after the person who had felt it was gone. He stole princesses not out of any genuine malice, but because he was reaching, incompetently and unsuccessfully, for something he could not name or remember but could not stop searching for. The episode aired alongside and was preceded by a rerun of an earlier episode, because Cartoon Network recognized that viewers would need the context. I Remember You was not designed to be experienced cold. It rewarded people who had been paying attention, who had noticed the small details about the Ice King across previous seasons, who had registered the moments where something sad flickered behind the comedy and then passed by. The song at the center of the episode, the one Simon had written, was composed by Rebecca Sugar specifically for this episode. It functioned simultaneously as a love song, an apology, and a goodbye, and it was performed within the episode in a way that made it something else. A song being sung by someone who did not know what it meant, to someone who knew exactly what it meant, in a room where neither of them could fully reach the other. The lyrics described a man who could feel himself changing, who was trying to make a record of what he was before the change was complete, who wanted someone to remember who he was even after he could no longer remember it himself. It was among the most emotionally sophisticated pieces of writing the show ever produced, and it was delivered inside an 11-minute episode of a children's cartoon, without ceremony and without announcement, trusting that whoever was watching would know what to do with it. The episode was watched by a significant number of people who were not children, which was always true of Adventure Time, but especially true here. It circulated across social media after it aired, being shared by viewers who described watching it alone at night and finding themselves unexpectedly moved. It generated a kind of quiet conversation that the show's sillier episodes never quite produced. People talking not about how funny it was, or how clever the world building had been, but about what it had made them think of, who it had made them remember, what it had felt like to sit with that specific sadness for 11 minutes and then close the laptop or turn off the television and sit in the quiet afterward. That is what the best episodes of Adventure Time did in the end. They created a space where feelings that did not quite have names could sit for a moment, observed and acknowledged and treated as real. I Remember You did that more completely than almost anything else the show ever made. It is not an easy episode to watch. It is an important one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. I Remember You showed us the Ice King through Marceline's eyes, and what she saw was a man she had lost to a crown long before anyone else noticed he was gone. In the next section, we travel back 996 years to see how that loss began, in a ruined world, on a road with no clear destination, with a small girl who needed someone to stay. Section 5. Simon and Marcy, 996 years before. The episode begins in the present, on a basketball court outside Marceline's house. Finn and Jake are playing a 2-on-2 game with Marceline and the Ice King, and the scene is immediately funny and easy and light in the way that the show could be when it wanted to let the viewer breathe for a moment. The Ice King is enthusiastic and bad at basketball, which is exactly what everyone would expect. Marceline is quick and competitive. Finn and Jake are themselves. Nothing about the opening suggests that the episode is about to do something that will take up permanent residence in the memory of everyone who watches it. Then Finn and Jake ask why Marceline invited the Ice King. He is, from their perspective, an annoying old wizard. They have defeated him many times. They do not understand why someone as self-possessed and capable as Marceline would choose to spend an afternoon with him voluntarily. And Marceline says, simply, that he is very dear to her heart, that she loves him. Jake, confused, says something like, "What are you even talking about?" And Marceline sits down and begins to tell a story. What follows is the flashback that is the core of the episode. 996 years before the events of Adventure Time, in a version of the world that still looked recognizably like the world before it was transformed into Ooo, a man named Simon Petrikov and a small small girl named Marcy were trying to survive. The episode aired on Cartoon Network on March 25, 2013. It was Season 5, Episode 14. It was written and storyboarded by Cole Sanchez and Rebecca Sugar, from a story developed by Patrick McHale, Kent Osborne, and Pendleton Ward. It was also the last episode Rebecca Sugar storyboarded for Adventure Time. After finishing the work on it, she left to create her own series, Steven Universe. She went out on something that many people consider among the finest 11 minutes the show ever produced. The world of the flashback has a quality that no other era of Adventure Time shares. It is neither the familiar Land of Ooo, with its candy colors and magical inhabitants, nor is it the recognizable modern world that existed before the Mushroom War. It is the space between those two things, the raw and broken middle ground, the period when the catastrophe had already happened, but the magic that would eventually transform everything had not yet taken full hold. The streets are rubble and ruin. Abandoned cars sit in the backgrounds of scenes. The creatures roaming the landscape are mutated, wrong-shaped, dangerous things that were presumably animals or people before the contamination changed them. There are no candy people yet. There is no Princess Bubblegum. There is no Candy Kingdom or Ice Kingdom or any of the cheerful geography of Ooo. There is just wreckage and two people trying to find food and stay alive. Simon and Marcy were scavenging outside a bombed-out city when the episode's flashback begins. They find nothing in the ruins worth eating, only the kinds of grim details that the show usually wraps in absurdity, but here presents plainly: a dead rat in a mailbox, empty shelves in a shop that once sold soup, the accumulated evidence of a world that ended before it could be replenished. Simon is funny about it. He cracks jokes. He holds the dead rat up and performs a little commentary about their situation, deadpan and dry, and Marcy laughs because she loves him, and because laughter is what you do when the alternative is sitting down in the rubble and not getting back up. That dynamic between Simon and Marcy across the flashback is the episode's emotional center and its greatest achievement. Simon, at this point in his timeline, is not yet the Ice King. He is still recognizably himself, warm, clever, self-deprecating, deeply attached to the small girl who has become his responsibility and his reason for continuing. He acquired the magical ice crown at some point before the flashback begins, and he is aware that it is changing him. He knows, with the clarity of someone still lucid enough to observe his own deterioration, that each time he puts the crown on, he comes back slightly less than he was before. He has promised Marcy he will not wear it. He keeps the promise until he cannot. The first time he breaks it in the episode, he hears something in the forest, something dangerous approaching, and he puts the crown on to deal with it. The power surges through him immediately, and he uses it to freeze a deer that had startled him, attacking it far more aggressively than the situation required. Staying in the Ice King mode even after the threat has passed, Marcy has to knock the crown off his head herself to bring him back. When he returns to himself, he looks at what he has done, a frozen deer, an overreaction, and he understands what it means. He promises again not to put it on. They both know the promise has limits. That night, Simon cooks the deer over a campfire, a small, pragmatic mercy folded into a dark situation. And then, because he is Simon, and because he loves Marcy, and because making her laugh is the thing he has decided he will keep doing for as long as he can, he does something that stopped viewers in their tracks when the episode aired and has never quite let go of them since. He climbs inside a broken television set. He holds up a VHS tape they found on the ground and deadpans that the book was better. And then he acts out an episode of Cheers for her, performing multiple characters himself, giving her the experience of watching something familiar and warm and ordinary in the middle of a world that has none of those things left. Cheers was an American television sitcom that aired from 1982 to 1993, set in a Boston bar where the regulars gathered, and the central joke was that everyone knew everyone's name, that there was a place where you belonged, and people who were glad you were there. The theme song, Where Everybody Knows Your Name, written by Gary Portnoy, is about exactly that feeling: belonging, being known, having somewhere to go where your presence is expected and welcomed. Simon sings it to Marcy while sitting in the broken television frame, performing it slightly off-key and with enormous warmth, and she laughs and settles and stops coughing for a moment. And the moment is lovely and fragile, in the way that only truly beautiful things are. The show used the actual Cheers theme song, not a parody or an approximation, the real song, and the choice was not casual. Simon Petrikov is a man from before the apocalypse, a man who grew up in the world that existed before it was destroyed, who carries in his memory all the textures and references and comforts of that vanished culture. He sings the Cheers theme because it is the specific thing he has that can translate warmth across the ruin of everything. It is a lullaby made from the rubble of a civilization, handed from a man who is losing himself to a child who has already lost almost everyone else. The middle of the episode follows them into the ruins of a soupery, the shop name itself a gentle joke, a shop in a destroyed world that still has its novelty gift cards on the shelves, but nothing actually useful. Marcy has developed a low fever, and Simon has decided with the particular stubbornness of someone who cannot fix the large things that he will fix this small one. He will find her chicken soup. The shop is empty. While they are inside, mutated slime creatures appear, and Simon is forced once again to put on the crown. What happens next is the episode's most devastating sequence. Simon puts the crown on and fights off the creatures, and while he is fighting, while the Ice King's power is running through him, he sings the Cheers theme song again. Not to amuse Marcy this time, not to make her laugh, he sings it to himself, quietly and with enormous effort, because it is the thing he is using to stay inside himself while the crown tries to pull him out. He is using the memory of an ordinary, warm, vanished world as an anchor against the force that is consuming him, reaching back through everything that has been lost to find the one thing that still feels like Simon Petrikov, a song about a bar where everybody knows your name. He fights off the creatures, he removes the crown, he comes back, but not entirely. Something is slightly more gone than before. When they return to their campfire that night, and Marcy thanks him and hugs him and says she loves him, he says something back. He says he loves her too. And then, in the single most painful beat the episode contains, he calls her Gunter, not Marcy, Gunter, which is what the Ice King calls his penguins. He does not realize he has done it. He is smiling when he says it. Marcy pulls back and looks at him, and the episode holds that look for just long enough for the viewer to understand what it means. The present-day Marceline, telling this story to Finn and Jake, goes quiet for a moment. Then she says that is the end of the story. Simon and Marcy lived happily ever after. She says it lightly, like someone who has decided that the story is allowed to have a gentle ending, even if that is not exactly what happened, because the truth of what happened is too large to finish out loud. The framing device returns. Ice King, who has been listening to the story along with Finn and Jake, says something cheerful and a little confused, not quite understanding why everyone has gone quiet. He is the Ice King. He does not remember being Simon. He does not remember any of it. Finn and Jake look at him differently now. They cannot look at him the same way they did before. That shift in how Finn and Jake see the Ice King, from bumbling antagonist to person who carries an enormous loss without knowing it, was one of the things Simon and Marcy accomplished more permanently than almost any other episode. The show had always asked viewers to tolerate the Ice King as a comedic nuisance. After I Remember You, and now after Simon and Marcy, it asked them to do something harder. It asked them to hold the comedy and the tragedy simultaneously, to laugh at him and feel for him in the same breath, to understand that the thing making him ridiculous is the same thing that destroyed something irreplaceable. The episode was the last work Rebecca Sugar produced for Adventure Time, and it shows not in any self-conscious way, but in the sense of care and precision that went into every frame of it. She had spent years on this show, building toward exactly this kind of emotional specificity, toward the kind of moment where an 11-minute children's cartoon could carry the weight of something genuinely complex about love and loss and sacrifice. Simon and Marcy was that moment, delivered at full volume without raising its voice. IndieWire published a piece after the episode aired titled, "Why Adventure Time is the Best Sci-Fi Show on TV Right Now," which specifically cited the episode's use of the Cheers theme as an example of the show's ability to translate cultural references into genuine emotional tools, rather than cheap nostalgia. The Crown, the article noted, was functioning as something close to a neurodegenerative condition in the story, a slowly progressive loss of self that Simon could not stop, but could only slow down by holding tightly to the things that made him who he was. The Cheers song was not a joke. It was a lifeline made out of memory. The episode holds a rating of 9.7 out of 10 on IMDb, placing it among the highest-rated episodes of the series. Fans consistently rank it alongside I Remember You as part of a paired emotional experience, two episodes that are best understood together, the second filling in the backstory that the first requires, each making the other heavier and more complete. Cartoon Network advertised Simon and Marcy as a half-hour special by preceding it with a rerun of I Remember You, which was the right instinct. Together, the two episodes form something that neither could be alone, a complete portrait of a loss so slow and so total that the person experiencing it could not document it in real time, and the person left behind could only carry the documentation alone. The present-day Ice King sat on that basketball court outside Marceline's house, cheerful and confused, and not knowing why anyone was quiet. Marceline looked at him for a moment. Then the game resumed. She invited him because he is very dear to her heart, because something of Simon is still there, not in his memory, not in his knowledge of who she is or who he was, but in the warmth of his presence, and the particular way he laughs, and the eagerness with which he shows up to play basketball on a Tuesday afternoon. She does not get Simon back by spending time with the Ice King. She just gets to be near the shape of where he used to be. That is what the episode understands about grief that most stories about grief do not. Sometimes the person is gone before they leave. Sometimes love continues in the direction of an absence. And sometimes a song about belonging is the most specific and honest thing a person can offer when the world has ended and they are trying with everything they have left left to stay. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Simon and Marcy showed us the cost of love without limits. A man singing a song from a vanished world to hold on to himself just long enough to keep someone else safe. The next section moves to a different kind of honesty, the kind that lives inside music and comes out sideways. In the episode where a door would only open for a song that was actually true. Section 6. What was missing? The door. Lord, the songs, and the truth. The episode opens with Finn alone in the tree fort, checking to make sure nobody is watching. He lifts a couch cushion, pulls out a small wad of pink gum, and begins to cuddle with it on the couch. It is a piece of Princess Bubblegum's hair that he had collected in an earlier episode, a Season 2 moment where he had been tasked with retrieving a lock of her hair to break a witch's spell. He had kept it, secretly and carefully, tucked away under a cushion, and he had clearly been spending quiet, private moments with it ever since. Jake and BMO reveal themselves from behind the couch, having watched the whole thing, and Jake tells Finn he already knows about his private time with the wad of Princess Bubblegum's hair. He is not mocking Finn. He pulls up a floorboard and shows Finn his own secret treasure, his baby blanket from childhood, soft and clearly beloved, kept with the same careful privacy that Finn had kept the piece of hair. The episode, before it does anything else, establishes something small and true about what people hold on to. Not trophies or weapons or magical artifacts. A lock of hair belonging to someone they have feelings for. A blanket from the earliest years of life, when the world was small and safe and someone was always there. These are the things that matter most to people in private. The things too soft and too personal to acknowledge in the open. The episode titled itself after this observation, What Was Missing? And then it proceeded to use a silly, energetic adventure plot to probe exactly that question about every character it put on screen. The Door Lord arrived almost immediately after the reveal of the blanket and the hair. He was a tall, angular, mostly silent creature who communicated in hums and who carried with him a ring of keys to magical doors that appeared wherever he needed them. He appeared in Finn and Jake's living room, snatched the lock of hair and the baby blanket and BMO's controller, and vanished through a door that slammed shut behind him. Finn and Jake chased him through a series of those doors, stumbled into Marceline's house along the way, found that she had also been robbed, continued through her house and out the other side into a rocky landscape, found Princess Bubblegum there as well, also robbed, and arrived together at a massive gate that would not open. Words appeared above the gate as they stood there catching their breath. This door shall yield to no command save for a song from a genuine band. That condition, a song from a genuine band, sounds simple enough. The group had instruments. Marceline had her bass. Jake shaped himself into a viola. Princess Bubblegum used BMO as an instrument by removing his face panel and connecting a hot plate to his internals. Something that should be deeply alarming, but in the world of Adventure Time reads as clever problem solving. Finn beatboxed. BMO contributed. They had what looked like a band, and they had songs, but the door did not open because the condition was not just about music, it was about honesty. The door only responded to songs that were genuinely true, not performed, not crafted, not constructed with the right chord progressions and pleasant melodies. True, songs that came from somewhere real inside the person singing them. The episode was written and storyboarded by Rebecca Sugar and Adam Muto, from a story developed by Mark Banker, Kent Osborne, Patrick McHale, and Pendleton Ward. It originally aired on Cartoon Network on September 26, 2011, as the 10th episode of Season 3. Rebecca Sugar later explained the episode's central intention in clear terms. It might seem like the episode is about friendship, she said, but she wanted it to be about honesty, about what happens when your emotional level is too high to just speak anymore, and music becomes the only available container for what you need to say. She cited Bob Fosse in describing the threshold the episode was trying to locate, the moment when speaking is no longer enough, when the feeling outgrows the ordinary language available to carry it. That threshold was tested differently by every character. Princess Bubblegum tried to lead the band with mathematical precision, turning music into a technical exercise, approaching the problem of the door the way she approached most problems, with intelligence and control and a belief that the right formula would produce the right outcome. The door did not respond. Her strategy was sound, but her song was not genuine in the sense the door required, because what she was offering was performance rather than truth. Jake quit the band dramatically and announced he was the jerk who was leaving, a move he had already admitted to Finn was something he was planning to do for fun, because every band needs one. It was a joke, but it was also accurate. Even his departure was managed, chosen, controlled. The failure of every structured attempt at opening the door was the episode's way of preparing the viewer for what happened when Marceline stopped being structured. She asked if she could give it a try. She picked up her axe bass, the red instrument shaped like a lightning bolt that she had carried across dozens of episodes, and she began to sing. The song was called I'm Just Your Problem, and it was written by Rebecca Sugar from a place that was, by her own later account, drawn from from a real falling out she had experienced. The song was addressed to Princess Bubblegum, though Marceline did not name her directly. It was about frustration, about the feeling of not being enough for someone, and resenting both that feeling and the person who made her feel it, about being put on a list of problems and not being able to remember what she had done to deserve the placement, about the specific indignity of still caring deeply about someone who had made her feel unwanted. The lyrics carried something that the episode had not previously made room for. Marceline, across her appearances in the show, had been cool and slightly distant and self-sufficient in the way that very old beings tend to be. She was 1,000 years old. She had outlived countless things. She had developed, across that long life, a persona built on not needing anyone, on being unbothered and capable, and slightly above caring about the ordinary attachments that preoccupied shorter-lived creatures. "I'm just your problem" cracked that persona open. It was the sound of Marceline not being unbothered, not above it, angry and hurt and still, underneath both of those things, wanting something she had lost and was not ready to admit she missed. The door began to respond. Not fully, but partially. The stone moved. Something in the magic of the mechanism recognized what was happening in that song as real, as the kind of genuine expression it required. And then Marceline caught herself mid-lyric, seemed to become aware of how much she was revealing, and the lyrics shifted. She pulled back. She covered the truth with something safer, and the door stopped moving. What the episode did in that moment was something quite specific about how people relate to honesty. It is not simply that honesty is difficult. It is that people often get close to it, feel the shape of it, begin to move in its direction, and then redirect at the last second, because being fully known by someone is terrifying in a way that no amount of self-sufficiency can fully protect against. Marceline was within reach of opening the door. She could not finish. The group fell apart after that. Princess Bubblegum and Marceline argued. Jake announced he was leaving. The band dissolved. Finn sat in the middle of it with instant noodles he had pulled from his backpack, gently suggesting that maybe, to be a genuine band, they needed to be nicer to each other and hang out as friends. He cooked the noodles on a hot plate plugged into BMO, and they sat together in the failing light while the sun went down and Marceline took off her sun hat and gloves. He sang a small, silly song about noodles. They laughed. Nothing was resolved, but something relaxed. When Princess Bubblegum tried to lead a second attempt at the door, she approached it differently. She drew equations in the sand. She tried to engineer sincerity through mathematical formulation. The notation she drew was Euler's identity, a famous equation in mathematics often described as among the most beautiful in the field, and Princess Bubblegum treating it as the foundation of musical truth was entirely in character. She was a scientist and a ruler, and she loved what she loved with the parts of herself that had been trained to solve problems. The door moved slightly, more than before, not enough. Marceline told her that her song was pretty, and then added that it was also kind of lame. Princess Bubblegum ended the attempt. They argued again, this time more personally, and the argument had the texture of something old, something that had been stored for a long time, a conflict that was not really about the door at all. Marceline accused Princess Bubblegum of never wearing the rock shirt she had given her. Princess Bubblegum stopped. She said that she wore it all the time, as pajamas, because it meant a lot to her. Marceline went quiet. That exchange, the shirt, was the episode's quietest and most important moment before the finale. Marceline had given Princess Bubblegum a piece of herself, something from her world and her identity, and had believed for some time that it had been ignored or set aside. That belief had been part of the injury. Princess Bubblegum had kept it, had worn it in the private hours, the sleeping hours, and had never mentioned it. Not because she did not care, because the kind of caring she was capable of was the kind done in private, in the quiet, away from the eyes of anyone who might see. She wore it as pajamas and did not say a word about it, and Marceline spent years not knowing. When the band finally came back together and Finn sang his own song, the one that would ultimately open the door, it was a different kind of honesty, simpler and more exposed. He sang about what everyone in the group meant to him, plainly and without embarrassment, while the others listened. It was not a technically complicated song. It was an honest one, and the door opened. Inside, the door lord was eating a sandwich, placid and unconcerned. When confronted, he communicated in his unintelligible hums, and the group collectively understood. What he had taken from them, the treasures he had stolen, had led them here, to this, to the things they had said to each other that they would not have said otherwise. At the end of the episode, after the door lord had been dealt with and everyone had their possessions returned, Finn noticed something. Marceline had gotten everything back. Jake's blanket and Finn's lock of hair and BMO's controller had all been accounted for, but the door lord had never visibly taken anything from Marceline. She had joined the chase on her own, arrived at the door with a grievance that had no object to recover. When Finn pointed this out, and when the group understood what it meant, Marceline got embarrassed. Not angry, not cool, not distant. Embarrassed. She had followed them because she wanted to spend time with them, because she was lonely in a way that her 1,000-year-old self-sufficiency could not entirely paper over, because company, even chaotic company, was something she missed. She had no stolen treasure. She just wanted to be there. She transformed into her large vampire form and chased them from the premises, shouting that she was going to kill them while they laughed and ran. She was not genuinely angry. They all knew it. The laughter said as much. The episode caused a significant amount of discussion after it aired. Much of it centered on the implied history between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum that the episode had surfaced without naming. A behind-the-scenes video series produced by Frederator Studios, one of the show's production companies, released a recap that described Marceline hinting at feelings for Princess Bubblegum that went beyond the platonic. The recap was pulled from the internet shortly after. The removal was itself controversial, and publications including Bitch magazine wrote about what the episode had done with female desire and queer emotion, and about what the suppression of the recap represented within the context of what children's television was and was not willing to acknowledge. The creator Pendleton Ward said publicly that there were so many strong positions being taken on the subject that he did not want to comment. In August 2014, Olivia Olson, who voiced Marceline, told a crowd at a Barnes & Noble signing event that Ward had confirmed to her that Marceline and Princess Bubblegum had dated in the past, but that the show had been unable to clarify this officially because it aired in regions where such a relationship could not be depicted. Olson later posted on social media that she had a habit of making things up at panels and that people should not take everything she said too literally, which added a layer of deliberate ambiguity to the situation that has never been fully resolved. What was resolved, definitively and completely, was the relationship itself. In the series finale, Come Along With Me, which aired in September 2018, Marceline and Princess Bubblegum kissed. 7 years after what was missing, the show confirmed what the episode had been suggesting the entire time, and that confirmation felt less like a revelation and more like a final piece of something that had always been almost visible, something the audience had sensed in the shape of the argument between them, and the way Marceline sang, and the detail about the shirt worn in private, and the fact that what Marceline was missing was never an object at all. The episode was a piece of writing about how difficult it is to say true things to people you care about. Not because the truth is cruel, but because it is vulnerable. Because offering the real version of how you feel about someone means allowing them to know that version, which means allowing them to do something with that knowledge. Marceline almost opened a magical door by accident, by dropping her guard for 4 seconds in the middle of a song, and then she caught herself and the door stopped. And then she had to wait for a boy who was 12 years old and entirely without self-consciousness to sing a simple song about his friends before the door finished opening. That asymmetry between what is felt and what is said, between what is kept as pajamas and what is acknowledged in daylight, between the rock shirt worn in the private hours and the years Marceline spent not knowing, is what the episode was about. Not the door lord, not the songs, not even the friendship. The gap between the truth and the moment when it finally gets said. Rebecca Sugar composed I'm Just Your Problem from Something Real, and it showed. Olivia Olson performed it with a voice that held both the anger and the ache without separating them. The door, bound by magic to respond only to genuine expression, moved. Not all the way, but it moved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What was missing proved that the things people hide most carefully are usually the things that matter most. Next, we go deeper into Marceline's past and what she was carrying long before she became the person who sang that song. Section 7. Memory of a Memory. Marceline's past and what was left behind. The episode starts running before it explains itself. Finn and Jake are already moving at full speed, carrying a small, armless wizard on Jake's back, sprinting toward Marceline's house for a reason neither of them fully understands yet. Jake asks who they are running for. Finn says he has no idea. Jake asks why he is running so hard then, and Finn, mid-stride, starts to answer and gets cut off by the wizard again, because the wizard is in a genuine hurry and has no time for the kind of reasonable question Jake is asking. The opening is funny and slightly chaotic, and moves so quickly that the viewer is dropped into the middle of things without warning, disoriented in exactly the same way Finn and Jake are, sorting out the situation in real time alongside them. This was the style of the episode's storyboard team. Memory of a Memory was written and storyboarded by Akko Castuera and Tom Herpich, and it originally aired on Cartoon Network on July 25, 2011, as the third episode of Season 3. The two storyboarders had a working relationship built on energy and visual invention, and this episode, which was their final collaboration as a team, reflected that partnership at its most confident. The structure it chose, dropping the viewer into motion and then pulling them deeper and deeper into something increasingly strange and personal, suited the material perfectly. A story about memories moving through other memories needed to feel slippery. It did. Marceline, the episode revealed, was trapped inside a sleep spell. She had apparently cast it on herself by accident. The armless wizard, who went by Rag Wizard, explained to Finn and Jake that the only way to wake her was to enter her mind, navigate through her memories, find a specific one in her memory core, retrieve it, and bring it back out. attempt. If they failed, Marceline would stay asleep forever. He demonstrated his ability to send them in by pressing his foot against Finn's forehead, having no arms with which to do it properly, and the tactile absurdity of being sent into someone's mind via a toe press was entirely in keeping with the show's particular flavor of strangeness. Inside Marceline's memories, the show did something it had not done before at this point in its run. It let a viewer stand inside the history of someone who had been presented so far primarily through attitude and surface behavior. Marceline, across her appearances before this episode, had been cool and guarded and self-possessed. The 1,000-year-old vampire queen who slept in caves and played her bass and floated through rooms with the ease of someone who had been in enough rooms across enough centuries to never feel genuinely out of place. She was compelling but opaque. The opacity was part of the character. Memory of a Memory was the first episode to dissolve it. The first memory Finn and Jake entered was the one that stayed with viewers longer than almost anything else the episode showed. A ruined city, still burning in places, tanks and debris scattered through the background, the visual evidence of a catastrophe so recent that the smoke had not cleared. And in the middle of all that destruction, a small girl sitting alone with a very battered teddy bear. She was repairing him. The bear, Hambo, had lost an eye, and young Marceline was stitching a button from her own jumper into the socket where the eye had been, using her last piece of thread to do it. She spoke to him while she worked. She told him she was hurting him because she loved him, in the tone of a child who had heard something like that said to her, somewhere, by someone. Hambo himself deserves attention because he was not incidental. He had been given to Marceline by Simon Petrikov, who had found him in an abandoned toy shop in the ruins of the post-Mushroom War landscape. He was the physical object that connected Marceline's childhood to Simon, to the years before she was alone, to the warmth of someone who had stayed. By the time Finn and Jake encountered him in this memory, he was already faded and worn and repaired so many times that the repairs had become part of his structure. He was a record of how much time had passed and how carefully Marceline had held on to him through all of it. He had no eye. She used her last piece of thread. She did it anyway. Young Marceline told Finn and Jake, who materialized as visitors in her memory, that Hambo was her only friend. The statement landed softly in the episode and has grown heavier in retrospect, in light of everything the show eventually revealed about how those years had gone for her. Simon had been there and then had progressively stopped being there as the crown took him. Her father, Hunson Abadir, the ruler of a dimension called the Nightosphere, had been absent in all the ways that mattered. She had been a child in a ruined world, carrying a stuffed animal with one good eye and a collection of repairs, and she had called it her only friend without self-pity, in the flat, factual tone of someone stating something they had long since accepted. The background detail of the burning city in that memory, the tanks and the debris and the collapsed structures visible in the periphery, was the show's earliest attempt to render what the Mushroom War had actually looked like at ground level. Before this episode, the Mushroom War had been a concept, a name for a historical event that explained why Ooh existed. Seeing it from the perspective of a small girl alone in its aftermath gave it a texture that no amount of exposition could have produced. The destruction was not abstract anymore. It was the place where a child sat and fixed a teddy bear because she had no one else to talk to. Finn and Jake moved through other memories as they searched for the one they needed. They passed through a moment where teenage Marceline walked into an abandoned diner and found her father, Hunson Abadir, eating her fries. This was the origin of a song called the Fry Song, which Marceline had sung in an earlier episode, and which had always been framed as a comedic overreaction to a trivial grievance. The memory made it less funny. The diner was broken and empty. The fries were, in a post-apocalyptic world with scarce food, not trivial at all. Marceline walking in and finding her immortal, powerful father consuming the food she had set aside for herself. In a world where food was difficult to come by, in a place where he had no material need for it himself, recontextualized the song completely. The grievance was real. The father was genuinely careless. The episode slipped that information into the background of the journey without stopping to highlight it. Further along, Finn and Jake found a memory of Marceline moving into their tree fort with a young man named Ash. He was handsome and a little flashy, a wizard who conjured a rose that said her name in a babbling, childlike voice and told her he loved her. And Marceline in this memory looked happy, in the unguarded way of someone who had recently allowed herself to want something and found it. She was not guarded here. She was young and open and glad, and the memory had the particular fragile sweetness of things that are going to end badly. The memory Finn's forehead marked as the one they needed was not far beyond it. In that memory, Ash revealed to Marceline that he had sold Hambo. Not by accident, not under duress, but deliberately and without particular guilt. He had traded the bear to a witch named Maya in exchange for a new cherry blossom wand. He explained it with a kind of impatient rationality, noting that the bear was valuable to Maya precisely because it was Marceline's favorite thing, that objects imbued with intense emotional attachment had uses in magic, and that this made the trade practical. He was not embarrassed. He produced the wand to show her. It conjured a small ghost that sang, over and over in a thin, mocking voice, that she was not a genius. Marceline's response, caused spot in the memory that Finn and Jake had found was not composed. Her cheeks went pink and her eyes filled with tears, and she told Ash that he was a psycho jerk and that he had ruined her life and that it was over, in a voice that sounded nothing like the cool, self-sufficient 1,000-year-old vampire who had appeared in the show up to this point. She sounded like someone for whom this was genuinely the final straw at the end of a long sequence of things. Someone whose capacity to absorb disappointment had finally hit its limit. Someone who had believed that this relationship was something safe to hold on to and had just discovered it was not. Finn and Jake took the memory they had come for and were pulled back out of Marceline's mind by the rag wizard, who then immediately revealed himself to be Ash. Not a real wizard, not armless. Ash in a disguise, having manipulated 2 children into stealing the memory of their own breakup from Marceline's mind, so that she would wake up without it, without the knowledge of what he had done to her, and find herself in a relationship she had no memory of ending, which was exactly what happened. Marceline woke up, confused and gentle, and greeted him as her boyfriend, and the two of them left together, while Finn and Jake stood in her house and processed what they had just enabled. What Ash had done, the episode was careful to show without editorializing heavily, was a specific and recognizable kind of manipulation. He had not changed what had happened. He had removed Marceline's access to the knowledge of it, not to protect her, but to benefit himself, to return a relationship to a state that existed before his behavior destroyed it, without changing the behavior at all. He wanted the outcome without the accountability. He wanted Marceline back without having to reckon with why she had left. Finn's solution was the episode's most quietly clever moment. He could not simply tell Marceline what had happened, because telling someone about a memory they no longer have is not the same as giving them the memory back. He could not recreate what had been stolen, but he had been inside her memory when it was still present. He had seen it, and so he did something the show presented as natural, without explaining why it was possible. He took Marceline into his own memories, showed her his memory of her memory, and let her watch herself break up with Ash from the outside, as a witnessed event rather than an experienced one. He had a memory of her memory inside his memory. The nested logic of it was the kind of thing Adventure Time handled with complete confidence, presenting it simply and trusting the viewer to follow without a diagram. Marceline watched the memory. Then she said quietly that she thought she would like to wake up now. They walked out of Finn's memories and back into the real world, where Ash was waiting and immediately demanded she make him dinner. She kicked him with efficiency and genuine feeling, and Finn joined in, and Jake stretched himself into a giant foot and delivered the final punctuation. The episode was the first in the series to show Marceline's history in any sustained way, and it established several things that the show would spend subsequent seasons building on. Hambo was the most important, a stuffed animal given by Simon, carried through centuries, repaired so many times that the repairs were structural, sold by someone who knew exactly how much it meant and did it anyway. The bear was a record of Marceline's long life compressed into a physical object. When it was sold, the episode was not describing the loss of a toy. It was describing the deliberate destruction of the one material connection remaining between Marceline and the person she had lost to the Ice Crown, the last object from those years, the thing she had held on to across everything. The show later returned to Hambo in the season 5 episode Sky Witch, where Princess Bubblegum tracked down Maja the Witch and negotiated for its return, trading away the rock shirt that Marceline had given her, the one she wore as pajamas because it meant something she had not found the words for. She gave away the thing that mattered most to her in order to return the thing that mattered most to Marceline. The episode did not announce that this was romantic. It simply showed it and let the viewer understand. Memory of a Memory was a season 3 episode, airing in 2011, before I Remember You and Simon and Marcy had established the full history of Simon and Marceline. In that context, the information it contained landed differently than it does now. Young Marceline, alone in a ruined city, was striking but unexplained. Hambo was significant, but its origin was not yet known. The episode was dropping details that would take years to fully illuminate, trusting that the show was being built carefully enough that the significance would eventually become clear. That trust was not misplaced. The background of burning tanks in young Marceline's memory, a detail that could have been set dressing, turned out to be the world immediately after the event that destroyed Simon Petrikov. The bear with the missing eye, being repaired with the last piece of thread, was the gift from a man who was no longer entirely himself, and the repair was an act of love aimed at the only thing left of him. The episode was telling a story in 2011 that it did not have the full language to tell yet, and the patience required to trust that the language would arrive is part of what made Adventure Time what it was. Finn and Jake walked into a mind and walked back out knowing more than they had gone in with. So did anyone watching. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Memory of a Memory opened the door to Marceline's inner life, revealing a past built from loss and the objects used to hold it together. The next section moves to Ice King's inner life, hidden inside a Christmas episode that disguised one of the show's most heartbreaking reveals as a silly holiday treasure hunt. Section 8. Holly Jolly Secrets. The moment Ice King became someone else. The setup is completely silly and completely sincere about being silly. Jake found a suitcase buried in a landfill and buried it again without opening it, because that is the kind of thing Jake does. He is a creature who trusts his instincts about timing. Finn eventually digs the case back up, and when they open it, they find a collection of VHS tapes that Finn recognizes immediately as belonging to the Ice King, having watched him bury them there sometime earlier. They decide to host a secret viewing party. Jake puts up flyers. The flyers specify that only Finn, Jake, and BMO are allowed to attend. One of those flyers makes its way back to the Ice King, who reads it without initially realizing that the tapes in question are his own. By the time he understands what is happening, Finn and Jake are already in their tree fort, watching the first tape, eating Christmas foods in the dim light of the television screen. Holly Jolly Secrets was written and storyboarded by Kent Osborne and Samvele Xiophone, from a story developed by Mark Banker, Patrick McHale, Osborne, and Pendleton Ward. It aired on Cartoon Network on December 5, 2011, as a two-part holiday special, the 19th and 20th episodes of Season 3. It was the show's first Christmas-themed episode, which came about partly from circumstance. The original plan had been a special where Finn and Jake watched actual Christmas movies and provided running commentary in a style similar to Mystery Science Theater 3000. Those plans fell through at a late stage, leaving the production crew needing to replace the Christmas programming that Finn and Jake would have been watching with something else. Patrick McHale developed the solution: the Ice King's Odd Home Movies. Pendleton Ward later described McHale's contribution as brilliant. The episode that resulted from that last-minute pivot became one of the most important in the show's entire run. The first tapes are exactly what the premise promises. They are the Ice King's private video diary, and they are exactly as strange and lonely and slightly uncomfortable as everything else the Ice King touches. One tape shows him complaining about his feelings in exhaustive detail, at length, while Finn fast-forwards through most of it. Another tape is a penguin dance party. A third features the Ice King wearing a black wig to perform a cover of Marceline's Fry song, which he renders badly and with great enthusiasm. There is a tape of him sitting in a corner crying. There is a tape of him playing a pretend newscaster, using a kidnapped Wildberry princess as his on-site witness. The running joke is that the Ice King believes these tapes contain terrible secrets, and Finn and Jake keep watching in hopes of uncovering those secrets, only to find tape after tape of a lonely old man doing lonely old man things in a castle full of penguins with no one to watch but himself. BMO eventually decodes what the boys have decided must be a hidden message in the tapes. The decoded image is a drawing of Gunter, the Ice King's favorite penguin, rendered out of the letter M. This is played as the punchline of a long comedic escalation. The audience laughed. The production crew knew the audience was laughing, and then they put in the last tape. The transition from comedy to the final tape is one of the most precisely managed tonal shifts in the show's history. What had been a collection of eccentric and slightly pathetic home videos, something Finn and Jake watched with the detached amusement of people hoping to find something scandalous and finding only something sad, suddenly changed texture entirely. The last tape did not begin with the Ice King. It began with someone else, someone in glasses, sitting in front of a camera in a room that was clearly from a different world, a world with airplanes visible through a window behind him, and the kind of orderly, furnished interior that did not exist in the land of Ooo. The man introduced himself in a careful, measured voice. He said his name was Simon Petrikov. Tom Kenny, who had voiced the Ice King across 3 seasons with consistent comic energy, did something different with Simon's voice in that tape. The eccentric vibration, the slightly unhinged enthusiasm that colored every Ice King line was entirely absent. Simon spoke with the careful clarity of someone who was trying very hard to communicate accurately, who knew that what he was saying mattered and wanted to make sure it was understood. He was still recognizably the same voice, but flattened out, normalized, returned to a baseline that the Ice King persona had been distorted away from. The effect was immediately disorienting. The voice was familiar and completely not what it had been. Finn and Jake, who had been watching with detached entertainment, sat up. Simon explained that he had been studying to be an antiquarian of ancient artifacts. He did not believe in the supernatural, he said, but had a fascination with superstitions. Then he came into contact with a specific item. He opened a safe on camera and removed a gem-encrusted crown, the same crown that sat on the Ice King's head in the present day, and he explained that he had purchased it from a dock worker in northern Scandinavia and brought it home to show his fiancée. Her name was Betty. He put the crown on his head as a joke, just for a laugh, just to make her smile, and that was when the visions started. He described what happened with the careful terror of someone who had been trained to be precise about observation and was now trying to apply that training to the most frightening thing that had ever happened to him. The visions, the hallucinations, fighting them and shouting at them, and then realizing they were coming from the crown, not from his own mind, and removing it and having no memory of what had happened while he he was wearing it. Betty looking at him with contempt. Not with fear, but with contempt, which was somehow worse. The look of someone who had seen something they could not unsee. He did not know what he had said or done while the crown had control. He only knew that whatever it was had been enough to push her away. The tape continued across subsequent segments. Simon's physical appearance changed as it progressed, because the crown kept being used and kept extracting its price. His skin turned slightly blue. His hair began going white. His nose stretched and lengthened. His eyes changed in a way that mapped onto the Ice King's eyes in the present, those white irises with dark rims, the crown's mark on a face that had been ordinary. He was watching himself transform across the span of these recordings, documenting the transformation with the same scholar's precision he had turned on everything else in his life, because it was all he knew how to do. He was losing himself, and he was writing it down. Near the end of the tape, Simon's voice had taken on a quality of exhausted acceptance. He was no longer describing a crisis he expected to resolve. He was recording something he knew was ongoing and irreversible. He looked directly at the camera, at whoever might eventually find these tapes, and he asked for something specific. He asked to be watched over. He said he wanted someone to stay with him until he could find a way out of the labyrinth in his brain and regain his sanity. Then he said that maybe Betty, his princess, maybe she would love him again. He was crying by the end of it. He begged for her to love him again. The tape ended. The Ice King, who had been fighting his way into the tree fort across the entire second part of the episode in an attempt to prevent exactly this from happening, was suddenly quiet. He said that Finn and Jake now knew his secret. He said he used to wear glasses. He started crying about the glasses. He said that maybe kidnapping Wildberry Princess would cheer him up. That single moment, the reveal that the Ice King's terrible secret in his own mind was the embarrassing fact that he once wore glasses, is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever produced. Not because it was a joke, though it functioned as one, but because of what it meant. The Ice King had watched a tape of himself as Simon Petrikov, a man begging for the love of someone he had lost, documenting his own disintegration with grief and clarity, and he had taken nothing from it. The man in the tape was as foreign to him as any stranger. He did not recognize the depth of what had been lost. He did not feel the loss. He processed the tape as an outsider would, saw a man in glasses, and felt shame about the glasses. The crown had taken everything. The grief that Simon had earned across those recordings was not available to the Ice King who had replaced him. Finn and Jake's response to all of this was the episode's second quietly important moment. Finn picked up the case of tapes and walked over to the Ice King and gave them back. Not as a gesture of sympathy, exactly, though sympathy was part of it. More as a recognition that these tapes belonged to something the Ice King could not access. That they were the record of a person the Ice King had no way of meeting, and that keeping them from him accomplished nothing. The Ice King took the case with delight, not understanding that it was a gift, or even why Finn would give it to him. He said he used to have tapes like this once, but had thrown them away. He said this was exciting. The episode originally aired to 2.513 million viewers, and its reception among critics was immediately strong. The AV Club noted that what had been a comedic premise built around silly home movies had transformed into something genuinely affecting in its final moments, and that the transformation was managed so smoothly that the tonal shift did not feel jarring. That smoothness was deliberate. The production had spent an entire episode building a comfortable, funny, ridiculous portrait of the Ice King's daily life, his dance parties and his penguin plays and his crying in corners, not as setup for a punchline, but as a foundation of familiarity against which the final tape landed with full force. After Holly Jolly's secrets, the Ice King could not be seen the same way again. Every kidnapped princess, every ice storm aimed at Finn and Jake, every lonely complaint about not having anyone to watch his tapes with, all of it was now adjacent to something that had no comedy in it. Simon Petrikov had loved someone deeply and had lost her to a crown he had put on as a joke. He had documented the losing of himself with precision and grief. He had begged a camera, and whoever might find it, to love him again. That the person who had made those tapes was now incapable of understanding what they contained was not a resolution. It was a long, quiet tragedy wearing the costume of a bumbling, recurring villain. The episode did something else that only became fully clear in retrospect. One of the Ice King's tapes showed him performing a cover of Marceline's Fry song. He had learned the song somehow, from somewhere, and had sung it in his own eccentric register without knowing why he knew it. The closing moments of Holly Jolly Secrets Part 2 showed for the first time that Marceline was outside the tree fort during the viewing party. She had not come inside. She had stood at the window and watched without joining, and the show offered no explanation for this. It was a detail planted with care and left deliberately unexplained. The I Remember You and Simon and Marcy episodes that came later would fill in everything that detail implied, but in the moment, it was simply a figure in the cold, watching through glass, present but separate. The show was built this way throughout its best seasons. It placed things into episodes that would not mean what they meant for years. Holly Jolly Secrets was a Christmas special, a silly holiday story about boys watching home movies, and it was was also the first time the show told its audience that someone they had laughed at for 3 seasons was carrying something enormous and had no way to put it down. The reveal was not dramatic in execution. It arrived on a VHS tape, in a living room lit by a television screen, while outside an old man in a blue robe was trying to get in and stop them from seeing it. Patrick McHale described developing the Simon Petrikov backstory as something that felt natural and necessary once the idea arrived. Pendleton Ward called the decision brilliant. Tom Kenny recorded the diary segments in a manner that Ward compared to authentic old-time radio horror. The voice of someone documenting the approach of something terrible with the only tools available to them: language, precision, and a camera rolling in a quiet room. The production crew noted that the final tape required significantly more work than the other content in the episode because the emotional register was so different from everything surrounding it that every detail of the recording needed to be right. What they built was a Wham episode hidden inside a Christmas special, something that changed the architecture of the show retroactively and permanently. Nothing before the final tape needed to be revised, but it all needed to be reread. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Holly Jolly Secrets hid one of the show's most important reveals inside a silly holiday tape watching session, and it changed every Ice King scene that came before it. Next, we trace something across the whole run of the show: Finn's arm, and what Adventure Time was quietly saying about growing up. Section 9. Finn the Human's Arm. Growing up in the land of Ooh. Adventure Time aged its main character in real time. That sounds like a simple production decision, and in some ways it was. Jeremy Shada's voice was changing as he grew up alongside the show, and the creative team chose to lean into that rather than fight it, letting Finn age from 12 at the start of the series to 16 by the middle seasons. But the decision had consequences that went far deeper than vocal pitch. Because Finn aged, the show was obligated to give him things that aging actually brings. Not just a taller frame and a cracking voice, but losses, failures, romantic heartbreak, and eventually the particular kind of grief that arrives when a person discovers that someone they had imagined into greatness was never as large as the imagining. Most animated shows give their protagonists the permanent safety of stasis. Adventure Time did the opposite, and the clearest single measure of that choice, the image that tracked Finn's growth more honestly than anything else across the show's run, was his arm. The arm meant something specific before it was ever lost. In the Season 5 episode, Blade of Grass, Finn acquired a magical grass sword from a grassy wizard, a blade woven from living plant matter that attached itself to his arm with what the wizard described as a permanent bond. The sword was powerful, responsive, and tied to Finn's emotional state in a way that the show presented as both useful and slightly ominous. When Finn was emotionally stable, the sword was fully under his control. When he was frightened, distressed, or emotionally overwhelmed, it acted on its own, extending and retracting based on what his inner state needed rather than what his conscious mind directed. The wizard had called it a curse at the moment of transfer, and Finn had accepted the description as a fair trade. He was 12, or close to it. He thought in terms of power and adventure. He did not yet fully understand that the things tied to your emotions have a way of doing things you did not choose when the emotions get large enough. The arm was lost in the Season 6 premiere, in the 2 episodes Wake Up and Escape from the Citadel, which aired on Cartoon Network on April 21, 2014. Finn was 16. He had spent a significant portion of Season 5 believing his biological father was still alive and imprisoned in a cosmic jail called the Citadel, having been told as much by his hero Billy in what turned out to be a deception orchestrated by the Lich. By the time Finn reached the Citadel, the belief had grown into something large and fragile. The way things believed for a long time tend to become load-bearing. He had imagined his father across years of not knowing. He had built the absence into something specific. He wanted an explanation for being left behind that was worthy of the waiting. Martin, voiced by Stephen Root, was not that explanation. He was charming and quick and entirely indifferent to the fact that he had a son. He recognized Finn without recognition in the way that means something was registered without anything being felt. He did not explain himself because he did not think an explanation was owed. He was a man who had, at some point, left a baby in a forest, and he had made his peace with that in the way of someone who had never not been at peace with it. When the Citadel began to come apart around them, Martin's response was to find an escape route, and his response to Finn trying to stop him was to arrange for Finn's grip to be broken. The grass sword took over when Finn could not hold on by himself. That is the precise and important thing about the mechanics of how the arm was lost. Finn was not reckless. He was not careless. He was holding on as hard as he could hold on, and when the strength of his body was not enough, the sword, which was tied to his emotional state and his need, extended itself into a massive arm made of tangled grass and held on for him. It held on because Finn needed it to. It held on because a boy who had been waiting his entire life for an answer to a question that should not have had to be asked was not ready to let go. The force of Martin's escape vessel pulling away from the Citadel was simply greater than what the sword and the arm and the need need together could withstand, and the whole thing sheared away. Finn fell into the water below with a stump where his right arm had been. A small amount of Guardian blood, the celestial healing substance that had been splashing through the area during the earlier battle with the Lich, landed on the stump. The blood had already demonstrated extraordinary regenerative power. It had regrown Martin's vaporized leg. It had restored flesh and skin to the Lich's bare skeleton, remaking him as a giant baby. When it touched Finn's stump, though, it did not regrow an arm. A flower grew instead. Small and single-stemmed, rooted in the place where the arm had been, fragile in the way that something growing where bone had been is always going to be fragile. The flower was one of the most visually inventive choices the show made across its entire run. Not a robot arm, not a magic arm, not a regrown limb, a flower, growing in the wound left by the sword that had been tied to his emotions, in the place where the arm had been lost in an act of need so great it exceeded the physical capacity to fulfill it. The image was not explained. The show did not stop to interpret it. It simply put a flower where an arm had been and moved on, trusting that the image would do its work. What followed in subsequent Season 6 episodes traced Finn's emotional state through the flower's condition with quiet consistency. In The Tower, which aired not long after Escape from the Citadel, Finn was not okay. He was further from okay than the show had previously shown him. He sat in the tree fort singing a song about tearing off his father's arm to replace his own, methodical and low and strange, and then began building a tower into the sky with telekinetic pieces of scrap metal, propelled by the phantom limb that his grief and rage were generating out of the remains of the grass sword's curse. Princess Bubblegum described this psychic arm as a dangerous telekinetic electro-emotional prosthesis. The show's language for what Finn was doing was as precise as the image of the flower. He was trying to reach something he could not reach by ordinary means, driven entirely by feelings too large for his body to contain. Jake told him to follow his heart at the beginning of The Tower. Finn was too deep in the anger about Martin to hear what that meant. He kept building. The tower grew tall enough to approach the edge of where the atmosphere became unbreathable. Princess Bubblegum flew up to bring him back. When Finn finally stopped and understood that what he wanted from his father was not available, that the explanation he needed was not going to be given because the person who owed it was incapable of recognizing the debt, the phantom arm dissolved. He had not recovered. He had simply run out of fuel for that particular version of not recovering. In the Season 6 episode Breezy, the show tracked Finn's emotional flatness after the Citadel through the flower, which was drooping. Dr. Princess diagnosed it in the show's characteristic mode of delivering real information in slightly surreal packaging. Flowers thrive on good vibes, she explained, and Finn's vibes were not good. He tried to manufacture better vibes by going around kissing various princesses, reasoning that if he could generate the surface behavior of someone who felt good, the feeling might follow. It did not. Each encounter left the flower more depleted rather than less, because what Finn was doing was performing feeling rather than having it, and whatever magic the grass sword's curse had left behind in the flower was apparently able to tell the difference. The flower eventually bloomed and became a tree branch overnight, bursting open to reveal a new arm underneath it, covered in a waxy substance and sporting a small thorn in the palm, the last visible remnant of the grass sword's curse made permanent in the new limb's structure. The arm grew back not because Finn had forced it, not because he had wished hard enough or been sufficiently heroic, but because something in him had settled. A genuine feeling, something warm and quiet and not manufactured, had passed through the exhausted space where Martin's departure had left a hole, and the flower had responded to it the way flowers respond to light. The arm went through further transformations across the remaining seasons. In the Season 8 arc, beginning with Reboot, the grass sword, which had been dormant since Breezy, re-emerged during a moment when Finn chose not to fight, and in the process of detaching from his arm, it fused with the Finn sword, a separate magical object that contained a version of Finn from an alternate timeline. The fusion produced Fern, a grass clone of Finn with all of Finn's memories, all of Finn's personality, and a slow corruption spreading through him that the grass wizard's curse was driving. Fern was not a villain in any simple sense. He was Finn's self-doubt given a body, a version of the question of whether the person Finn was the right person to be, made flesh and given a sword and sent out into the world to act. The loss of the arm, the flower, the phantom limb, the grass arm, the regrown arm with its thorn, and finally, Fern, formed a continuous thread across seasons 5 through 8 that was Adventure Time's most sustained piece of character writing. Each stage of the arm's story corresponded to a stage of Finn's emotional development, with a precision that was never over-explained and never heavy-handed. The sword tied to his emotions was lost while he was trying to hold on to a father who did not want to be held. The wound grew a flower that thrived on genuine feeling and died in the presence of performed feeling. The arm came back when something real moved through the place where the hurt had been. The remnant of the curse took form as a version of himself he had to eventually face and could not save. The farm world version versions of Finn that had appeared in earlier episodes had already established that the loss of his right arm was something the show treated as connected to his identity across timelines. Farmworld Finn had a robot arm from a childhood accident. Ice Finn had the arm transformed by the crown. Recurring image of Finn with a missing or altered right arm across multiple realities and multiple versions of him suggested that the loss was not incidental to who Finn was, but structural to it. The show was not making a statement about disability representation, though that reading has merit and has been made by viewers. It was making a statement about what it costs to hold on to something that does not want to be held, and what grows in the place where something is torn away, if a person can survive the tearing long enough to find out. Finn was 16 when the arm came off. He was still a teenager when it grew back. He was the same person and not the same person, the way growing up always works. The way the word growing implies both addition and loss simultaneously. Adventure Time used an arm to track that process across seasons with more precision and more honesty than most narratives aimed at adults managed to achieve with years of deliberate effort. When Fern died in the season 10 episode 3 Buckets, destroyed accidentally by a weapon Finn did not fully understand he was carrying, the grass clone burst into pieces, and Finn came home despondent and traumatized. Jake and BMO tried to comfort him. Something of Fern persisted, gathered up by a distant figure, and eventually returned in later episodes, because Adventure Time was always careful about what it let end and what it let become something else. The show was not interested in clean conclusions. It was interested in what comes after the thing that hurt you, and what grows in the place where the hurt has been, and whether the thing that grows is yours or something new. A flower where an arm had been. That was the image. The show let it mean everything it needed to mean, and did not say another word about it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Finn's arm traced his growing up across the seasons with honesty that most shows never reach. The final section brings us to the end of everything. The series finale, the last battle, the song Rebecca Sugar wrote, and what it feels like when a world you loved says goodbye. Section 10. Come along with me. The end of an adventure. The finale begins 1,000 years from now. Two young adventurers named Shermie and Beth are living in a version of Ooo that looks familiar in some ways and completely transformed in others. They find a metal arm in the ruins of a structure and bring it to the king of Ooo, who lives at the top of a mountain in a house full of old things. The king turns out to be BMO, small and square-screened and wearing a makeshift beard and a crown, 1,000 years older and still himself in every way that matters. BMO looks at the metal arm and goes quiet for a moment, in the way that very old beings go quiet when they have been returned to something they once held. He calls the arm's owner Phil. Shermie corrects him. BMO says Fred. They tell him that is also wrong. BMO settles, and something in his face screen shifts, and he says the name he was trying to find. He says Finn. Then he begins to tell the story. This structural choice, beginning the series finale in a future where the events of the show are already history, was one of the most quietly confident decisions Adventure Time ever made about itself. Come Along With Me aired on Cartoon Network on September 3rd, 2018, as a 44-minute, 4-part special, episodes 280 through 283 overall, the final episodes of Season 10, and the end of a series that had run for 8 years. The executive producer was Adam Muto. The episode was written and boarded by multiple members of the production team. Former crew member Ghost Shrimp returned to contribute backgrounds. Rebecca Sugar returned, for the final time, to write one song. By framing the entire finale as a story being told by an elderly BMO to two young people who were not yet born when it happened, the show was making an argument about what stories are and what they do. BMO was not narrating for accuracy. BMO was narrating for meaning, passing something along to people who would carry it forward, the way all stories eventually work. The adventure had happened, it was over, and it was also, in the telling, happening again, alive in the present tense of someone listening. The show had always understood that time in Ooo was strange and layered, and not easily linear, and it ended by putting that understanding directly into the architecture of its finale. The story BMO told returned to the present of the show, Princess Bubblegum gathering her forces for the Great Gum War, a conflict years in the making between the Candy Kingdom and the candy people Princess Bubblegum had created 800 years earlier, chief among them her uncle Gumbald, who had spent centuries plotting revenge for being transformed into a simple candy person at the height of their original falling out. The war had been building in the show's final seasons as its large-scale dramatic thread, the suggestion that everything the series had been moving toward might end in violence between people who had come from the same place and should have been capable of understanding each other. Finn, who by the time of the finale was old enough and weathered enough to have learned something about what wars cost before they are fought, tried to prevent it. He arranged a parley between Princess Bubblegum and Gumbald, and when talking failed to produce the shift he needed, he activated a vial of nightmare juice that Jake had been carrying, sending everyone present into into a shared dream. Inside the dream, Princess Bubblegum and Gumball were forced to experience each other's suffering directly. Bubblegum lived as a simple candy person under an unhappy ruler. Gumball inhabited the anxieties of someone responsible for an entire kingdom's safety. The dream forced the thing that conflict usually prevents: genuine understanding of what the other person was carrying. Finn, meanwhile, found Fern in the dreamscape. Fern, the grass clone who had spent months consumed by a grass demon's corrupting influence, trying to replace Finn and failing, burning with the specific grief of someone who believed that another person's existence was the obstacle between them and their own right to be. Finn faced him not as an enemy, but as himself, because that is what Fern was. The grass demon that had been driving Fern's corruption was destroyed inside the dream. Fern disintegrated, freed from it. When everyone woke up, Bubblegum offered peace to Gumball, and Gumball, in the moment of accepting it, was tripped by his ally Aunt Lolly, who doused him with his own dum-dum juice and returned him to a simplified candy state. Lolly accepted the peace in his place. 2 candy kingdoms were declared. The war was over before it began. Then Golb arrived. Golb was not a new presence in the show's mythology. He had been referenced and briefly glimpsed across earlier seasons as something larger than the Lich, something larger than any of the entities the show had previously dealt with. Where the Lich was a sentient force of extinction with an agenda and a patience, Golb was something older and more fundamental, the embodiment of chaos and discord itself, a being that did not act with purpose because purpose was not something it was capable of. It did not want to destroy Ooh, it was simply what it was, and what it was incompatible with Ooh continuing to exist. Golb had been summoned accidentally by Betty Groff, Simon Petrikov's long-lost fiancée, who had spent years in the show trying to reverse the curse of the Ice Crown and restore Simon to himself. She had linked herself to the Sky Witch Maya and attempted to harness Golb's power for that purpose, and what arrived was not something that could be harnessed. The entity descended onto Ooh and began incorporating people and structures into itself, pulling them into something that transformed them, and the war that had just been prevented became irrelevant against something this large. What the show chose as the weapon against Golb is the detail that has stayed with viewers more than any other element of the finale. The creatures Golb produced were creatures of disharmony, Princess Bubblegum observed. They could not be harmed by conventional fighting. They were not weakened by force or cleverness or magical power. They were weakened by harmony, musical harmony specifically, the resonance of voices and instruments working together in agreement, producing something unified rather than discordant. BMO, small and square-screened, and the least physically imposing presence on the battlefield by a significant distance, found Jake sitting in the ruins of the tree fort, which Golb's creature had destroyed, and scooped him up and said something tender and slightly reversed about being the papa today, and began to sing. The song BMO sang was called Time Adventure. Rebecca Sugar wrote it for this episode, having left Adventure Time years earlier to create Steven Universe, and now returning for one final contribution. The lyrics were about time as an illusion that helps things make sense, about always living in the present tense, about how something that ends does not disappear but becomes part of the permanent past. Sugar later explained the thinking behind the song. She wanted to write about how even if something ends, it continues to exist in the past, and nothing ever really goes away. She said she was nostalgic for the years she had spent working on Adventure Time, and found comfort in the idea that she still existed in that office with Adam Muto, working on those stories. Because the past is not eliminated by being the past. It simply moves into a different relationship with time. The song spread. Marceline picked it up. Princess Bubblegum joined. Jake, recovered enough to be present, amplified all their voices with his shape-shifting body. The residents of Ooh, all of them, gathered and began to sing, their voices combining into a harmony so complete that Golb's creatures faltered and shrank. Inside Golb's stomach, where Finn and Simon Petrikov had been consumed, the digestive process of the chaos entity was stripping away the Ice Crown's corruption from Simon, returning him layer by layer to himself. Simon Petrikov, intact and lucid, emerged from centuries of being the Ice King with nothing but his own name and his grief for Betty and the memory of everything he had lost and everything he had done. Betty, who had loved Simon across the entire span of his absence and had spent years in the present trying to restore him, made the final choice of the show's longest-running tragic thread. She had the Ice Crown restored to its essential wish-granting nature by Golb's dissolution of its accumulated power. She could wish Golb out of existence. When she tried, it did not work. Golb was too fundamental, too woven into the structure of things to be simply wished away. What she could wish for was Simon's protection. She could wish that he would be safe, regardless of what happened to her. She made that wish. She fused with Golb, and the merged entity left the planet through a dimensional portal, and Simon stood on the ground of Ooh, calling after her, and she was gone. The grief of that moment belonged to Simon Petrikov, not the Ice King who had no capacity to experience it, but the man who had been returned to himself in time to watch the woman who had loved him sacrifice herself so that he could live. Marceline, who understood that grief in a way nobody else in Ooo could, stood beside him and offered what she had, her presence. It was enough, in the way that presence is sometimes the only thing available and also the right thing. Fern, freed from the grass demon's corruption, but still disintegrating, asked Finn and Jake one last thing. He wanted to be planted at the tree fort. They did it, pressing what remained of him into the earth where the fort had stood, and a tree grew from the seed of his remains, tall and immediate, with the Finn sword embedded in its highest branch, gleaming in the light of Ooo. It was not a sad image. It was not precisely a hopeful one. It was the right one. Something transformed rather than ended. Something that had been one thing becoming another thing in the same place. The finale's epilogue moved through every character in the show with the generosity of something that knew it was saying goodbye and wanted to do it carefully. Gunther, the Ice King's penguin who had always loved the ice crown most of all, found it lying where Betty had left it and wished on it, and became a version of the Ice King himself, harmless and penguin-shaped, and exactly as the penguin had always wanted to be. Simon went to Prismo's time room to use a wish to search for Betty, still trying, still going in her direction, even with no guarantee of arrival. Marceline and Princess Bubblegum were shown on Marceline's couch together, in pajamas, watching a puppet show, cups of tea in hand. Not a dramatic reunion, but a quiet, ordinary evening, the kind of thing 1,000 years of existence had apparently been leading toward without either of them knowing it. The storyboarder, Hannah K. Nystrom, had been given creative control over how the Marceline and Bubblegum moment would be realized. The script called only for the two characters to have a moment. Nystrom drew them kissing. The only note executive producer Adam Muto wrote in the margin next to that choice was the phrase, "Come on!" with a large exclamation point. He could not argue with it. The show confirmed in its final episode what it had been suggesting since season 3, what was missing had been circling, and I Remember You had been feeling, and Holly Jolly Secrets had been building toward, alongside a completely different storyline. What the shirt worn as pajamas, and the song almost opened the door, and the years of arguing that were not quite arguing had been about the whole time. 7 years after the question had first been raised and never answered, it was answered the only way it needed to be, by showing it. Shermie and Beth, 1,000 years in the future, left BMO's mountain with the story inside them. They went to find the great tree where Fern had become something else, grown enormous across the centuries, the Finn sword still visible in the highest branches. Shermie climbed and pulled the sword free and held it up, and the image matched the show's title sequence exactly. A figure with a sword raised, a companion at their feet, the world of Ooo stretching out in every direction around them. The adventure continued. Not this adventure, not Finn and Jake's adventure, but adventure itself, which does not end when the people who were doing it stop. It passes to whoever comes next and finds the sword. The Music Hole, a magical singing pit in the ground that the show had used sparingly across its final seasons, sang the song that gave the episode its name, Come Along With Me. The lyrics were about doors and going through them, about not being afraid, about everything waiting on the other side of the choice to move forward. As the song played, the show offered its final images of everyone it had built across 10 seasons. Jake's son opening a detective agency, Gunther's penguin Ice King marrying Turtle Princess in a small ceremony, Simon standing at the entrance to Prismo's time room, Marceline and Bubblegum on the couch, Susan and Frida somewhere on the ocean still exploring, Minerva leading the last of the humans across the water toward Ooo, finally arriving in the place the show had always implied they were heading. BMO's face screen showed a picture of Finn and Jake and a moment that had passed. The song was about how it had not really passed at all. The show premiered with 2.6 million viewers in 2010. It ended on September 3rd, 2018 with just under 1 million. The audience had changed across 8 years in ways that audience numbers do not capture. The people who had been 12 when Finn was 12 were 20 in the middle seasons and close to adults when it ended, and they had grown alongside a show that had grown alongside them in ways that very few animated series attempt and almost none achieve. They had watched the Ice King become Simon, become the Ice King again, had watched Marceline carry 1,000 years of loss with a coolness that was always also protection, had watched Finn lose an arm to a father who would not stay and grow a flower where the arm had been, had watched a magical land built on the bones of catastrophe stay warm and strange and worth living in across every disaster that tried to end it. The AV Club gave the finale an A. IndieWire called it a bittersweet goodbye that felt exactly right. Critics across publications noted that it managed the difficult task of ending something genuinely beloved without diminishing what it had been, without resolving too cleanly the things that were never meant to resolve, without pretending that the world of Ooo could be neatly concluded when a world is not something that concludes. Time is an illusion that helps things make sense, Rebecca Sugar had written, so we are always living in the present tense. The show was happening, had happened, and through the watching and the remembering and the telling to someone who was not there was still happening. BMO sat on the mountain with a crown and a makeshift beard and could not remember the name at first, and then found it and set it quietly in the dark. Finn. The sword was in the tree. The adventure was already the next one. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.